Welcome to our Climate Wisdom Studio live from COP30 in Belém in Brazil. We bring together scientists, politicians and activists to explore new solutions for the unfolding climate disaster. Myself, I'm Golo Pilz, and I will be the moderator on today's session, which has a very interesting title, Empowering Communities and Protecting the Planet. As usual, some ideas from the climate conference, some updates. This morning, interestingly, a group from indigenous Munduruku community blockaded the entrance for several hours. They only dispersed when Andre Correa de Lago, the president of the conference, talked to them. They are upset at plans to privatize rivers in their region and stated, "We were always barred. We were never listened to." As a result, the entrance to the conference has been heavily secured by armed military forces. Inside the conference, delegates are deadlocked on the big four issues at this climate conference, which are finance, trade, transparency, and the national climate plans. Hence, COP President de Lago proposed a presidency consultation. A new approach is being tried. Therapy sessions. Delegates were invited into safe spaces to share feelings and be listened with empathy. A shift from the normal negotiation standards to an honest dialogue. Further, de Lago asked parties to write confidential love letters detailing their true feelings, fears and hopes. This innovative, psychologically minded approach aims to move beyond old positions and process past frustrations, hopefully enabling progress at this summit. This is an absolutely novelty at a COP, but perhaps if negotiators overcome their anger, grief and trauma at the last COP20 of the last 29 COPs, some kind of progress can be achieved at this one. So this is a very novelty. Let us see how it pans out. I'm very glad to have two special guests with us who will shed light on the climate conference in the context of today's topic, empowering communities, protecting the planet. With us is Kumi Naidoo. Welcome, Kumi. And you are a well-known South African human rights and environmental activist, and you currently hold multiple positions. And I just picked out some. You are the president of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. You're a professor of practice at Thunderbird School of Global Management, and you're lecturing at Stanford University and a visiting fellow at Oxford, and amongst many other positions and things you have done. And you have served from 2009 to 2015 as the International Executive Director of Greenpeace, and from 2018 to 2020 as Secretary General of Amnesty International. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
And I'm very glad to have with us tonight also Maureen Goodman. You are the Brahma Kumaris Program Director for the UK, and you are representing them also at the United Nations in Vienna. You have been to many, many UN conferences, I think also to climate and biodiversity conferences, and you have a deep interest in spiritual and ethical dimensions of climate change. You are also since long been involved in the interreligious dialogue. Welcome, Maureen.
Thank you.
Very lovely to have you both with us. And this brings me to my first question. Kumi, please share with us what is currently your main focus and what brings you to the COP30 in Belém?
So the first thing that we must remind ourselves is that what causes climate change? What is the root cause of climate change? So the science tells us that 86% of what's driving climate change is our dependency and our addiction to oil, coal, and gas, which we call fossil fuels. Now, it's extraordinary to think that it took 28 years before the words fossil fuels was even mentioned in a COP outcome document. I say that's as crazy as Alcoholics Anonymous holding 28 years of conferences before they get a backbone to mention alcohol in the outcome document. So our focus here as the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative is to make progress with regard to getting a phase-out plan for fossil fuels. Now, obviously, we all know that we can't switch it off tomorrow because it's so baked into our lives in so many different ways. So the idea behind the treaty, and we're so pleased that of the 17 nations that have already stepped forward to say we need to start negotiations, 3 of them are actually fossil fuel exporting countries whose economies depend on the sale of fossil fuels. Colombia, Pakistan, and Timor-Leste. But they're saying, much as that be the case, we know it's right for humanity and right for our children and their children's future that we must phase out. So Colombia will announce in the next days that they will be holding the first international diplomatic conference for the phase out of fossil fuels in April in Colombia. But so what we're doing is we're building momentum both for President Lula's stated commitment that he said on the first day that we need a fossil fuel phase-out plan. So we hope that there is some deep and clear commitment to addressing the root cause, and also then to build momentum for the next phase. Because I never talk in terms of the road to the COP. Usually at the beginning of the year, activists start saying the road to the COP. I always say the road through the COP, right? That in fact the COP is a moment, and we shouldn't put all our eggs in the basket. I'd just like to conclude my answer by saying what we have been doing wrong for years now has been, and to put it very simply, imagine you rush home one morning and you go to work, and you come back home and you discover that in fact you see water coming out of your bathroom. And as you pass the kitchen, you pick up a mop and you open the bathroom and you say, oh, I've left the stopper in the bath and the water was dripping a bit and it filled up during the day. What do you do first? Do you start mopping the floor first, or do you turn off the tap first? And so basically the main purpose that I'm here this year is to convince our governments we have to turn off the tap on the problem, which is we have to move the fastest possible timeline for the phase out of fossil fuels, which should be fast, fair, and funded.
Thanks very much for sharing these points. I'm living most of the time of the year in India, and this year Pakistan was really severely devastated by very serious rains, and thousands of farmers lost their farmland.
Absolutely.
And really situation in Pakistan is very, very, very dramatic. And North India, Pakistan, Punjab, which is the wheat chamber of India, was also devastated by unseasonal rains. And so I can imagine that Pakistan has a big interest to deal with climate change and phase out fossil fuels. That's very encouraging news that this slowly comes on the table, despite there's quite some resistance actually to that also now. So Maureen, many local communities here in the Amazon live in harmony with nature based on their ancestral spiritual traditions. And here in the West, we are more urban-centric approach, more brain approach. And how can we learn and integrate these deep-seated spiritual knowledge and connections to the land, how that can inspire us in the West, and what can we learn from the indigenous communities?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. It was very interesting being in COP15 for biodiversity, which was in Montreal. And at that time, of course, the slogan 30 by 30, 30% of species to be preserved by 2030. I thought, what about the other 70%? That was one question. But in Canada, the government actually took the Indigenous people off their land so they can manage it to achieve their target. People just thought this was crazy. The Indigenous communities know how to look after the land, how to preserve the balance of nature, because the worldview is one of connectedness. It's not one of separation, and it's not one of dominance. It's not the dominant worldview, it's the Indigenous connected worldview. And I think this is the main thing that we have to learn from. And okay, you know, the way we live in cities, we know it's not actually natural to us, natural to human beings to live in this way, but here we are, we're living in an urban environment. And so we are finding technical solutions such as renewables. And I was hearing the other day actually from you that what's being stated in the COP, that renewables are now unstoppable, which is great. I mean, it's fantastic. But for this momentum to be sustained, it has to be done with the right motivation. Has to be done with the motivation of care, concern for the environment, and a word that I've been hearing in this COP, which I'd never heard in COP much before, to do it with love for the planet. I was, if we don't have this kind of motivation behind what we're doing, even with the technical solutions, which are great, are we going to keep using those methods to still have the same lifestyle? You see what I mean? It's a change in lifestyle that's needed if we're really going to think about helping and, really equitably, sharing with people who, the poorer nations or the developing nations. We have all these labels, but we're all in it together, actually. And I was thinking of the analogy, I thought, if you have a baby or a child being fed and brought up by a robot, it won't work. It needs the love of the mother. And so whatever we're doing for the planet, this is what we need to take, this motivation of real care and concern. Then we will make the changes that will be long-lasting, and we'll be able to share our resources.
Can I just strongly support what you said and just remind ourselves that 80% of existing biodiversity in the world is protected by indigenous peoples.
Yes, exactly.
And it's critically important that today, when we reflect on the world, that even the term that was used historically when indigenous peoples were referred to as uncivilized, right? It turns out that indigenous peoples are the more civilized of all. And if we listen to them more, because they, as you say, have lived in harmony, because bottom line is humanity must understand that unless we live in a mutually interdependent relationship for nature, we will not be here for centuries and centuries to come. Unless we can get that right, we are not securing the future of our children.
Interestingly, at this COP also there's a record number of indigenous people, and they are doing their level best to be heard, And I think the summit also will start soon, and let us see what will come out.
But also have to say in COP16, local communities and indigenous people were made official subsidiary body, which was a breakthrough in its own way.
All right, this brings me to my next question. Kumi, you have consistently highlighted the power of artivism, not activism, but artivism, and that means storytelling combined with art to mobilize a change. Can you share some examples where art has successfully empowered a local community?
So, just to clarify, artivism is the coming together of arts, culture, and activism. One of the reasons we have failed over these decades is that we've tried to move the people of the world by aiming all our narratives at the brain. We've ignored the heart, the body, and the soul. And that's not how people change. Right? People change when they are touched inside their souls. So when you talked about love, for example, so at the treaty, at the fossil fuel treaty, one of our main mobilizing messages is protect what you love. Protect your family, your children's future, the local park, and so on. So to give you an example, in the neighborhood where I live, which is a low-income neighborhood in Johannesburg, South Africa, some young people have come together to set up a movement called the Don't Waste Art movement. Right? So basically we have a problem with garbage. Right? So they try and collect the garbage and use the same garbage to make art. And they're doing, food gardens in schools and so on. We need to be supporting these local things so that they can mushroom and grow on a large scale. But let me tell you the one moment that I, as a boring mainstream activist, heading up big organizations and so on, my epiphany moment really came when the artist Olafur Eliasson invited me and Mary Robinson to come to Iceland. Called, said, Kumi, I need you to come to Iceland. I said, what's happening in Iceland, Olafur? He says, we're having a funeral. I say, oh, I'm so sorry, who passed away? And then he said, a glacier. And on an early Sunday morning, we were at the bottom of this glacier. Mary Robinson, the Prime Minister, and myself offered a few comments. We walk up this dead iceberg, which happened to be called a glacier, which happened to be called OK. Its name was OK, but it was not okay.
No more okay.
And there was a plaque that said, at this moment of history, humanity knows what we need to do to save ourselves. Let's hope if you're reading it, we did what we should. And that evening, when Olafur and I were together, he says, let's just go online and see what kind of impact that event had. And I can tell you, I'm not saying it just to be modest, but it was more impactful in impact, how the media picked it up and so on, than 95% of the actions that happened during my 6-year leadership of Greenpeace International. And then I had to think why. And the question was, I didn't talk about 1.5 degrees. Mary Robinson didn't talk about 350 parts per million. We didn't drown people in their alphabet soup of acronyms that comes out of a process like this. We talked about loss. We've lost something that humanity had for centuries, and it's not coming back. And everybody understands loss, whether you lost a lover, whether you lost somebody through death, and the fact that people could understand. So journalists and so on around the world picked up this story and the impact that it had, not just to the community in Iceland, but to people around the world who saw it and said, well, we need to be standing up and defending things that we love and we don't want to lose, because our children deserve to have the same ecological assets and richness that maybe our generation grew up with.
So we have to deal with the heart of the people and touch their feelings.
I just say Iceland, the land of ice and fire, people are very connected to nature.
Yes.
Been there many times, and it really is quite, the whole culture is quite different. Yeah.
Maureen, as we look at the COP here in Belém a little bit from above, how can spiritual organizations and spiritual leaders move beyond simply advising and requesting politicians, you have to do this or you have to do that, and instead actively facilitate the inner transformation which is required in all of us? So leaders become more courageous, they're inspired themselves to take planet first decisions. What should we do to inspire them?
I think, as you've been saying, it's very much about touching the heart. And when the heart is touched, then things can change, and there is courage. First, I would say one thing, though, which I've said a few times, that we need more people at the table. We need faith communities at the table. We need indigenous people at the table. We need, and really at the table in the negotiations. And in fact, one of the Bishop of Stockholm, who was being interviewed, he said every country delegation should have a religious leader as part of the delegation, because faiths give a very different perspective. And I think also because faith communities are often there as first responders in a disaster.
Absolutely.
So they absolutely know what's happening for people on the ground. And they're there because of their faith and because their hearts are moved and they want to bring benefit to humanity on a wider level. So it's moving out of that box of my country and my vested interests, etc., into a vision of, is this going to benefit the whole community? Is this going to benefit the world? Is this going to benefit the most vulnerable? And I think that a lot of people who are negotiating, who are in these delegations, they themselves are conflicted. And so what you mentioned about the presidency, calling it a therapy, wanting it to be more therapy, nobody highlights the trauma that these people are actually going through themselves. And I have spoken to some of them that they know what their conscience is saying, and yet they know what they're meant to say so it's really about nurturing people to have that inner spiritual strength, and then they will have the courage to say, and they're more likely to have the courage to say, actually, this is not the right way to go. This is what we need to do. I know time's ticking, but okay, I won't carry on because you need another question.
I just wanted to share also yesterday, we almost go every evening here to the cathedral opposite.
Yeah.
And 2 days ago, there were 4 bishops there. And when the Protestant bishop was there with him together, we went inside with 4 Catholic bishops. And the whole cathedral was packed with youngsters. They were all having T-shirts for the SDGs, development goals, and protect nature and all this. And apparently it was a prayer session, and it was a mass for nature and to bring them all together. And they all met here in the cathedral. And I think we should also not underestimate the power of prayer.
Absolutely.
And the power of meditation, sending good intention towards the negotiator, good intention towards the politician. I can imagine this have also an impact because everybody has these fine antennas and receives actually the thoughts and the vibrations we can send out. So thanks very much for sharing. It's very deep insights. This brings me to my last question to you, Kumi. The crisis we are facing, I think we can all agree, underneath there is a spiritual and ethical crisis. We have not only to heal planet Earth, but we also have to heal actually our hearts and our soul. Somewhere on the way of humanity, we have lost connection to the divine, I can say. So how to reconnect to the divine and build up resilience and hope?
Well, I don't think we are able to address the climate crisis if we don't define certain key moral questions of our time. The faith and spiritual community should ideally be helping us and supporting us on that journey. I was privileged. My mom, when I was 12 years old, when a teacher at school was trying to convert me, he converted and he was trying to convert all the students. So I came home and said to my mom, this teacher says that this is the best religion and so on. And my mom said to me, the only religion you need is see God in the eyes of every human being that you meet. And that's what's guided me. But I've come to realize that it was inadequate in the sense that we have to see the spiritual in every living thing, including non-human beings, the spirituality of our rivers and our oceans and so on. And the truth is, we must be truthful here, that many of our faith leaders have stayed silent for far too long and have not stood up, because if you believe that God exists, then God didn't only create us, God created the mountains, the oceans, the forests, and so on. And it's true, more and more religious leaders are now standing up, and we welcome that very warmly. But for a long time, the silence was a bit deafening in terms of standing up for God's creations that were not human. And so right now, I would say that we have to recognize that we're dealing with a massive mental health crisis. I myself lost my son through suicide 3 years ago. Right? A child who was very sensitive about what was happening in the world, right? And there are girls I meet all around the world who ask me questions like, is it okay for us to be thinking of having kids? How horrible that our generation let down young people that they are facing those questions. But if we are going to get out of the mess that we're in, we have to recognize that we need to take care of the mental health, especially of young people, and things like meditation, things like creating, I don't want to be prescriptive, of course, of what kinds of healing that people embrace. There's lots of healing from indigenous communities around the world, which colonialism tried to wipe out. Thankfully, their resilience is still there, and I myself, for example, today draw on many of the indigenous healing traditions. So I think this complicated world we live in, you have to imagine that there's a spiritual dimension to it, and whatever your particular preference is, it doesn't matter. And also, I'm also of the view is within spirituality, you should also accept the rights of people to hold a view where they say, I believe God does not exist, for example. Right? That's a worldview. It's just a different worldview. And it doesn't mean that they are bad people. So we have to create a big diversity of opinion where people can see the spiritual in plants, in animals, and in people every day of their lives. Unless we get that, we're not going to be able to muster the kind of momentum that we need to make the big changes that we need to make.
Thanks very much for sharing. I hope now Maureen can guide a meditation and sort of bring a bit in practice what has been spoken, seeing in everybody, see in the eyes of everybody God's love and compassion, see the creation, and are responsible for it, and that we empower communities and that they can protect nature. Thanks very much for sharing all your insights. And Maureen, can you guide us for a short meditation?
Sure. So sit comfortably and let us go first on an inner journey to recognize the deep value of myself, a being within the physical costume of my body, a being that has inherent goodness, inherent value. In my original state, I am a being of peace. And this state of inner peace changes my vision and perspective on our world. I begin to see the value of every living being on this planet, the wonder of our earth itself. And I'm able to be an instrument, a channel for divine love to enter into our world. A divine love that heals, a divine love that transforms. Let me share those pure vibrations of love with the whole world, so that our world can be transformed and there is harmony, togetherness, and a flourishing world results.
Thanks very much, Maureen, for a very lovely meditation. And thanks a lot to our speakers, Kumi and Maureen. Maureen, for being with us and sharing really deep insights. And I hope our audience is inspired. And thanks also to our patrons and sponsors and all the helpers behind the camera for making this studio, this Climate Wisdom Studio, possible. Please also join us for another interesting live session of Climate Wisdom. For details, visit our webpage, echo.brahmakumaris.org/live. And please stay tuned in. We play a short video and then we'll commence with part 2 of today's session. Last not least, thanks very much to you for staying with us, and goodbye from Belém, from the COP here in Brazil.
Connections nourish us. It's what makes us human. They tie us to the land, to the air we breathe. But the climate crisis is threatening the very fabric of life.
Extreme weather,
massive floods,
temperatures soaring.
Thousands of people have been evacuated.
100,000 people have been evacuated.
Rising.
And the culprit? Fossil fuels. We know they're poisoning our world. But instead of phasing out fossil fuels, many governments are ramping up. And it's time to quit.
Oil is now flowing through the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion.
Work will begin to extract crude from the Rosebank oil field.
We need an exit ramp off the highway to climate.
We need a new plan. We need a fossil fuel treaty. A global call to
stop the expansion of fossil fuels.
Phasing out fossil fuels to adjust the equitable transition.
We've stopped weapons of mass destruction before. With a stroke of a pen. And we can do it again. Wealthy nations must move first and fastest. And other nations are already leading the way.
This treaty is imperative and monumental. We can no longer wait.
No hay otro camino.
To face down coal, oil, and gas.
Communities have stepped up, championing a movement all over the world. It's the connections we hold dear and that we're striving to protect that will ultimately save us. After all, we can't help it. It's what makes us human. Protect what you love.